Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Meyer. I'm the Communications Coordinator with the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. We're glad you could join us today for the webinar on working with tribal communities. I'm going to go over a few short housekeeping rules and then pass it over to Kylan to introduce our speaker today. Please mute yourself to minimize background noise. We encourage you to keep your cameras on, since we're a small group, it's nice to see friendly faces during the webinar. Please use a chat box to post any questions you have. We will have a couple of opportunities during the webinar to address questions, so if you post them in the chat, I'll monitor that and make sure we get those addressed. And then also finally, keep an eye on the chat as we'll be adding links to some relevant resources to today's presentation. I think that's it from my end, so I'll turn it over to Kylan to introduce Vicki. Thank you.
So Vicki is a familiar face for most of us on the line today that we've come to know and love. But I will do a formal introduction as I have the pleasure of introducing Vicki today. Vicki is a technical assistance advisor for the National Center from Red Wind Consulting. She provides technical assistance to tribes as well as teams that are working with tribes. She co-facilitates the peer leadership group with Lisa Furr from Lifespan. And Vicki identifies as Navajo and Hickwilla Apache and Mexican descent. She has been working to address violence against Indigenous women for the past 36 years. So I have the pleasure of introducing Vicki to everyone today. Thank you, Vicki, for being here with us. And thank you for continuing to educate us and being willing to host these webinars. Thank you so much. And we look forward to today's webinar. And I will pass it off to Vicki.
So I'm just really glad to have this opportunity to talk about working with tribes with this group. I know I bring up pieces from time to time when we have other conversations. And I'm really hoping that through today that you'll get a lot more information. So as Kylan mentioned, I've been doing violence against Indigenous women work for the last 36 years. And with that work, I started as a part of focused on domestic violence. And then shortly thereafter started working on sexual violence. And then about 8-9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, Bonnie Brandel reached out to me to provide some assistance in terms of working with grantees that were working on elder abuse. And that was a really meaningful partnership for us because it really gave me an education about elder abuse that I didn't fully understand at that time. And I had the good fortune to work on a project that led to the development of a product called Reclaiming What is Sacred. And we did that through holding a listening session. We interviewed a lot of grantees between OVC and OVW. And then we held a listening session in New Orleans where we brought an intertribal representation of folks that were working in the field or trying to work in the field and learn from tribes about what tribes needed. So I'm going to bring some of that information into this presentation for this discussion today. So we're OVC funded. Here is the grant disclaimer and the grant number and our learning objectives today. I really hope that as a result of this webinar that you all will be able to explain 2 ways historical trauma applies to Indigenous elders, and also that you have a deeper understanding of Indigenous peoples as it pertains to working with elder abuse, and be able to identify 3 steps you can take to involve tribal partners and have a greater understanding of cultural options for Indigenous elders. So I think it's important for us to start to really acknowledge who are we talking about. As of not the most recent, but the 2010 census, there are 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives. And one of the things that's really significant about that is that often when we think about tribes and where they're located, what we don't fully understand is about how tribes are recognized. So we have 574 tribes that are legally recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs of the United States government. So that basically means they have federal recognition. And as a result of having federal recognition, they also have, it means that they have federal resources that are available to them. But in addition to that, there are multiple other states that are recognized by tribes. So there are 11 states, Alabama, Connecticut, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia that also have 63 state recognized tribes. And I think that's an important distinction. What we find is when we think about the colonization of this land, that in the earlier years, as settlers came to this land, Native peoples were pushed off their lands, and through that, we find that more frequently on the eastern seaboard, those tribes that continue to exist in those areas have a more difficult time to get federal recognition. And that's a whole longer discussion, and I won't go into that because of the lengthy process that federal recognition is. But what's been really significant is that the states, not all the states, but some of the states have been working with the tribes to assist them in accessing federal resources, and through that have afforded them state recognition. I worked with tribes in Virginia, and through their Attorney General's office, where the funding was coming into the state for the tribes. And then they had me come in and do work with the tribes. So that's just an example of some of how that plays out. So the other thing that's really significant and important to understand, when people think about tribes, what often is believed is that all Native people live on tribal land, or primarily all Native people live on tribal land, which that's really a misnomer. 78% of American Indian and Alaska Native people reside off tribal lands, off reservations. And so when we think about that, of the millions of people, so we're talking 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives, we really have significantly large populations in urban centers. And that was not only because of, but significantly impacted because of laws that took place back in the 1950s, which was a process of relocation, offering Indigenous people opportunities to move into urban centers, to access resources, providing stipends and transportation to relocate people. And as a result of that, while our urban Native populations are not stagnant, we really see our urban populations moving between tribal lands back to urban centers, back to their homelands, and moving back and forth. And there's more of a migratory movement that happens, seeking resources, which might include education, mental health, medical care, chemical dependency care, jobs, different things like that. And this is really significant, particularly as I speak to those of you working with non-Native MDTs, because many people are not aware of the Indigenous populations in their urban areas. So for example, because I live in Colorado, I'm real familiar with the Colorado statistics. And so in there, we have 2 tribes in our state, which comprise about 5,000 people of our population. Yet we have 88,000 Native people located in the state of Colorado, with the primary population in our most populated areas on the Front Range of Colorado, which includes Denver. And Denver contains about 78,000 urban natives. And I know Chicago has over 100,000 urban natives. Los Angeles is represented by over 200 tribes. I don't know their data in terms of the population there. So it's important to know that, because oftentimes data is not being collected. So when we look at what kind of statistical data we're looking at within our state, within our urban centers, we will oftentimes see Caucasian African American, we may see Latinx, and then we start going into other categories. Whereas here in Colorado, some data shows Native populations, other data shows them blended into other population where we can't get the breakdown. So like when we look at the data around the victimization of abuse, we don't see Native people identified within that population. So I think that's important to know as you're thinking about your work and looking at who the populations are that are being served by the programs represented in your MDT. So for me, it's always important for us to think about who we are talking about. And so when we think about our elders, they are our keepers of our tribal history, our culture and tradition, and they are the best hope of tribes to pass on tribal history, culture, and tradition to youth, adults of the tribes. In every way, our elders must be protected. And one of the things that's not represented in here in this quote is also elders carry our languages, which when we think about our languages, it really carries our values. So as I work with tribes across the country and we talk about how elders as well as other age groups are experiencing violence, the more closely held tradition and values are, the more difficult it is to describe the violence because the language does not have words for abuse and physical harm and emotional and mental harm. And so in that, what we have seen is that people that are closer to their language will come in and say, I'm being bothered, or somebody's bothering me, my partner, my husband, my son is bothering me. And the reaction will be that, well, that's not really our job because we really deal more with something bigger than being bothered. And so without staying present and hearing completely from that elder and engaging with that elder, we're actually missing an opportunity to actually understand what they're saying when they're talking about being bothered. And so when we think about our traditional Indigenous beliefs about elders, one of the things that's important to realize is that elders really have a different meaning. That word elder often has a different meaning, a distinct meaning within our tribes and our Native communities. And so basically the designation of elder is often bestowed on people who are regarded as teachers, as mediators, as advisors, as medicine people, stewards of tribal lands, keepers of culture. And so people that are held in high esteem. And so when we think about that, we really want to understand what that means. And I know Benita's on this call, and we've had some conversations about what does it mean when an elder passes on. And Benita was sharing in a conversation with me recently that it basically a library has been destroyed, has gone up in flames because of all of the cultural knowledge, the history, the language, all of the wisdom that elder carries. And so when we look at traditional Indigenous beliefs about elders, there's going to be variations from tribes. I don't want to give the impression that across all of the tribes that are located within the United States, that they are homogenous. Tribes are not homogenous. That tribes are unique and distinct in the way they operate, in the way they're structured, as well as different values that they hold close and dear. But there are common beliefs that are carried across the tribes as well. And so when we look at this graphic here, we can see some of the different common beliefs, such as sharing wisdom to help ensure community permanency and balance, preserving traditions, keepers of the knowledge, holding a unique and important social position, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, aunties, uncles, brothers, and sisters. And like even being called that is also a recognition of your position. So for instance, I have a cousin who refers to me as auntie. And although by definition in the United States, he would be defined as my cousin, but because of who I am to him and how I'm positioned in the family, I'm actually held in more esteem. So I'm an auntie to him. So that's a really important understanding. So sometimes people get confused when we use some of these different terms because we're not following distinct bloodlines. We're talking about the esteem, the knowledge, the position in the family, and how we are honoring that person as well. So we can't talk about elder abuse without connecting to and talking about historical trauma. And so when we think about historical trauma, we're really reaching back, but we're also somewhat current in terms of events. And I just want to let you know that I'm getting ready to talk about some really hard stuff. So when we talk about historical trauma, that it's cumulative. So it's a trauma that has happened through multiple events. It's a collective experience. It's not just one Indigenous person experienced this, that collectively, either collectively this tribe, collectively this region of tribes, collectively all of the tribes have had experiences of emotional and psychological injuries in their communities and within their descendants. It's historical unresolved grief is an important part of that. And it's the result of historical trauma that has not been sufficiently acknowledged, expressed, or otherwise addressed. And that's really significant because, you know, even when I go back and I talk about the statistics and how it's hard to find data about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' experiences, that's one way that Indigenous people still continue to carry unresolved grief, because people, even their current grief is not even being acknowledged and seen. There's a layer of invisibility that's playing out. And then there's disenfranchised grief. And so when we think about disenfranchised grief, it's really the product of historical trauma when loss cannot be voiced publicly or is not publicly acknowledged. So this slide, I really want to spend just a few minutes talking about this and creating some connection in terms of understanding historical context, understanding it as a part of historical trauma, understanding it as a part of how it plays out today. And afterwards, I want to just kind of give a little bit of pause if you've got any questions to respond to those questions before we continue to move on. So what's really important about this is I want to say that this is a representation. So while there are multiple, what I would say really horrendous and egregious acts of violence that had transpired over multiple centuries, that this is just a small representation of what really transpired. And so when we think about the consistent and systematic attempts to impact our nations, I need to speak about the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide. So genocide through the 1994 convention, UN Convention, describes genocide as beyond the outright murder of people, as the destruction and extermination of culture. And in Article 2 of that convention, it lists 5 categories of activity as genocidal when directed against a specific national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And these categories are the killing members of the group, causing bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberate infliction of the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So when we look at that UN convention, the 94 UN Convention on Genocide, and we look at from the point of contact, starting with the 1600s, moving forward, we can see multiple incidents where there was direct infliction of harm, direct, there were massacres and other ways that people were being murdered. And such as in the 1700s, there were the smallpox blankets. So blankets were being distributed to tribes that were infected with smallpox. And there was a lot of death that happened as a result of it. And then we have other types of incidents such as the Bear Creek Massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre, and the Wounded Knee Massacre, which is only a small representation of massacres that transpired on this land called the United States. And also in the 1800s, the boarding school era started. And it was a period of forcible removal of Indigenous children as a part of a policy that took place over 100 years and was implemented by the federal government and put in place by the federal government and implemented by different religious organizations across the United States. And so people would, depending on where you're located, one area would say Catholic, another area would say Mormon, another area would say Baptist, another, would say Orthodox. And it really was about the local religious institutions where the different tribes were located. And through that forced removal, children were being, the intent was to assimilate. So they were forcibly prevented from using their language. So if you think of a 6-year-old all of a sudden being in a different environment, in an institution away from their family, not being able to speak their language, which is the only language they know, having their hair cut off, which is also it's a powerful traditional practice that recognizes the strength of people as well, and having that cut off, and then being punished anytime they used culture, traditional practice, being punished every time they spoke their language. And so that practice transpired over 100 years. And today, so understanding some of the impacts, I think yesterday or the day before, I saw a thing that I had mentioned before about how remains were being found at different boarding schools. Well, now we've got up to about 7,600 graves that have been found. And as a part of that coming forward, our elders are a people who have lived through and experienced that boarding school era. And as we are talking about current day history about the remains of children that are being found at these boarding schools, it's awakening that trauma that our elders have been carrying through their entire lives. So there's all of these different policies and practices, and I think it's important to realize also another significant thing is that the United States is a country, a nation founded on religious freedom. And that was why the migration came to this land. And it wasn't until 1978 that Indian religious freedom was actually legally afforded to Indigenous people, which we still know in some ways, in some places across this country, that there are still barriers to Indigenous people practicing their own spiritual beliefs. And so I hope through this timeline, it gives you the understanding, like a lot of time people think about when we talk about historical context for violence, that we're talking about something centuries old and not recognizing that this is lived experiences of people. I have a friend who's about my age. I'm 65 years old. She's an Alaska Native person, and she actually saw the on-site set of colonization happen in her vision in her lifetime. And so her first point of contact with a non-Native person happened when she was 16 years old. And then she watched the erosion of the Indigenous values, the imposition of different values, of different things that brought harm to her village. And so when we talk about this historical context, its impact is playing out today. Our Indigenous elders are living with it today. And when we work with a current incident of elder abuse, we are opening up and we are also touching the historical trauma. And we can't work with the one incident of violence without working with the other, the historical trauma. And I do want to acknowledge one other thing about historical trauma, and then I'll pause for any questions if there are any, is that when we look at all of this trauma, historical and multi-generational trauma, that is not given the attention that it needs. It's not given an environment where there can be healing that occurs. What happens is it starts imprinting on our DNA. And so we now know, and it's more recently in the last 10 years, that we are seeing these impacts of historical trauma, of how it's changing people's DNA over generations. And so we have health impacts that our Indigenous people have higher mortality rates. We have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of heart disease, and other types of health impacts that play out as well. And that's true for other populations, such as the forced slavery that happened as a result of people of African descent coming to this land, have similar impacts through the historical context for violence that they experienced as well. So I know that this is all really hard information, and for some people it's new information. So I do just want to just give a little bit of pause, see if there's any questions before moving on, or any comments people want to make. So this was the hardest part. Yeah. So it's easier from here. Not 100%.
It is hard.
Easier.
I mean, I'm blessed that I've had exposure to some, really good teachers of this over my lifetime. But I also, when I think about it in conjunction with elder abuse, I also feel it differently. Like maybe when I'm younger, I'm thinking, this is horrible, what can I do? And then as an older person, I'm like, wow, this is horrible. And there's this additional sadness because, I don't feel like I can, or there, time is lost. And I wonder how that feels for a Native elder as well, that, there's this additional sadness with historical stuff, and then something happens to them individually, and how does that impact that feeling of helplessness? And so that's sort of what I was thinking while we were just, while I was just feeling what you were saying.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nancy, because I do think it connects to thinking about Indigenous elders reporting abuse. There are so many ways that this historical violence, this historical impact and trauma plays out in terms of how an elder is going to see the system as a response. So one, because, so thinking about elders on tribal land, our federal partners are going to be part of our response. So that could have an impact in terms of how trusting people feel about that system. But then there's other ways, even other, like such as social services or adult protective services, other organizations who are not necessarily connected to a federal response could still be seen as problematic, because when we look at like child removal. So also in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed as a response to the boarding school era. And what we still see in states today is the high rates of forced removal of children through the termination of parental rights through child protective systems, and states not following the Indian Child Welfare Act. So elders know that. And whether they're living on tribal land or in an urban area, they know that. And so again, it's that social service system. Is that a reliable system? Is that system going to hear me? Is that system going to believe me? And is it really going to help me? And for us, I think our challenge is to find ways to work through that, and then making sure we hear what the elders want in those last years of life as well. So I want to make a connection to tribal nations, because a lot of times when people think about Indigenous people, Indigenous people are often thought as another community of color. And while that is only partially true, the rest of the information has to do with this unique relationship that tribes have with the federal government. So when we look at tribal nations and that unique relationship, is that tribes themselves are nations. So the way tribes are, we are domestic sovereigns. Our tribal nations are domestic sovereigns within the United States. So basically there is a government to government relationship, one nation to one nation relationship. And so our tribes can, when we think about sovereignty, that sovereignty is the ability to carry your own direction. So that is about that we can make our own laws. We basically say, this is what we need. We figure out our own responses and we guide that. Tribes have their own internal infrastructure, which includes a criminal justice system, and operates with that, and operates their own social service structures, builds their own roads, puts in place their own water systems, all of that. Tribal nations are nations. And I think that's an important distinction, because with that, as citizens of those nations, we are being connected to those nations, and as citizens, we are protected by those nations. And how that affects you that may be working with an elder off tribal land is that if that incident of abuse happened on tribal land, now we have a whole different system that's coming into play. And it's not something where a state authority can easily just go into that tribe. So it's important to understand that sovereignty, because it also impacts the way we build our relationships. So I want to mention the Violence Against Women Act just briefly. So when we look at VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, it was a law passed in '94. And one of the things that was passed early within VAWA was full faith and credit, which allowed for protection orders. And so every, county, within your states, you can get a protection order within your county, within your city, different things like that. And back then I used to live in Duluth, Minnesota, and right across the bridge is Wisconsin. And I had a protection order at that time, and I couldn't cross the bridge before full faith and credit. And then with 1994 and the passage of VAWA and full faith and credit, when that came into play, that wasn't a problem. So you could cross the bridge, you could leave counties, you could cross state lines, and your protection order would be good. Well, it's been problematic for tribes ever since the onset of VAWA. So in 2005, Title IX, Safety for Indian Women, was created as a section in VAWA to address the needs of tribes as a part of it. And full faith and credit originally included tribes, but urban areas, counties, a lot of other places fail to recognize tribal protection orders. And so then in VAWA 2013, the protection orders were put back in specifically for tribes every time tribes have been in there in language. And this time there's a specific section in there to address the requirement of full faith and credit for tribes. And because Redwin works in urban areas, we still have across the United States places that do not recognize a tribal protection order. So if you were working with an elder and the incident happened on the tribal land, and maybe they left and had a protection order, and then come into, you know, your community, and then people, because it may not be in the protection order registry, that then they say, well, it's no good, and want them to go back through the court system, get a new protection order. And that's not a good practice, because it has an effect of impacting the sovereignty of tribes if we're not honoring their orders. So we, through Redwin, we work with tribes, or we work with advocates to teach them how to work with the local community to get those orders recognized. So another one I want to mention is the Tribal Law and Order Act that passed in 2010. And one of the things about Tribal Law and Order Act, there were multiple good pieces, and this is like a super, super condensed version of it. But it provided for concurrent jurisdiction of the federal government and Indian tribes over the prosecution of federal crimes in Indian country at the request of a tribe. Now, this is another one that has redundancy, because tribes already, as sovereign nations, have concurrent jurisdiction. So tribes already have that authority. And then where there are laws that bring the federal responders in play, the tribe, it doesn't mean that the tribes lose their sovereign authority to exercise their jurisdiction. And it's not a double jeopardy situation. So tribes already have concurrent jurisdiction as tribal nations. So it's important to know that. Tribal Law and Order Act also allowed for increased sentencing, as well as one other piece that just escaped me. So I won't even try to find it. It just completely gone. So anyway, it's one of those laws that, because we have so much trouble within different states recognizing sovereign authority of tribes, that within different federal laws, we'll see where it's recognized in one place, it comes back in and has to reassert it because it's not being recognized over and over again. We even have tribes where within, like California, it's a public law 280 state. And I'll talk about that when we do the webinar on jurisdiction. And with that, it basically means the states have jurisdiction within tribes. And we have some counties that refuse to enter tribal lands to do their job, because they have, they're responsible for policing and law and order on those tribal lands. So when we think about our MDTs and how to involve tribal communities, and this is really a big piece in here, is that it's not like we can, like we know the director of social services or, something like that within the tribe, and that we can just get permission from that director if we want to work with that tribe. What we need to do is recognize that sovereign relationship. And if we're going to bring services onto tribal land, we need to have agreement from tribal leadership. So from the governing authority within that tribe. So basically, in comparison, we would, if we were looking at it from the United States and we were coming in from France, if we wanted to provide services here in the United States, we'd need to get the approval of Congress. So within a tribal nation, if you want to provide services on tribal land, you need to get the approval of the tribal governing body. So when you work with tribes directly, if they're, and I know Utah and Michigan MDTs are working with tribes, and we've already had some of these conversations about that. Then when we think about working within a community, such as an urban center, that's a different setting. So you're not working with the tribe itself. You would be working with the resources that are available within the community. So again, connecting back to Denver because of the resources I know in Denver. So we have the Denver Indian Center, we have the Denver Indian Family Resource Center, we have the Denver Indian Health Center, and those are 3 great resources to reach out to. And they are all urban programs and are nonprofits. So you would want to reach out, identify who's doing Native specific work, and be really careful about who you're reaching out to. So like here in Colorado Springs, we have one program that's called, I won't name them, that they basically have a name that identifies them, that appears to look like they're working only with Natives, and that they're Native run and Native operated. And they are basically a charitable based organization. But when you look at their board of directors, it's all non-Native. When you look at their staff, it's all non-Native. And so while they're providing charity to Native people, they are not Native owned and operated. And so you really want to make sure you have people that have a real clear understanding of the Indigenous community. They can't speak for everybody in the community, but they might have their, they might have their ear to what's happening in the community, be knowledgeable of how they're connecting back to their tribes, be knowledgeable, like for us here in Colorado Springs, because we work right in the Indigenous community, we have 3 mental health professionals that are Native that are located in 3 different organizations that we access when we are working with people that have mental health needs. We also know who the traditional spiritual people are if we want to do a sweat or if we want to help them engage in ceremony connected to their own traditional Indigenous beliefs. So when we think about people being a part of an MDT, one of the things when we think about the different roles and asking people, and if we're asking a tribal partner they can represent any of the different categories. But when we think specifically about a tribal partner, that they also can bring information about understanding a tribe's custom and culture, tribal resources and programs, victim safety and autonomy and confidentiality related to the tribe, and understanding the resources that are available through that tribe. So for us here at Red Wind, we have a local direct services, domestic violence and sexual violence program called HASIA, and we serve intertribally, and we actually, we serve up to about 100 distinct different tribes. So our staff are not knowledgeable across all those tribes. We can't, there's just no way we can be. But what we do is we know what resources are available, and we let them know, this is what we know. Here's these multiple different options, and let them make their own decisions about it. We operate our own sweat, and we actually have, we had a staff, and now we're just adding another staff that can service the poor and run that sweat for us. So we have traditional healing options that we offer, and other culturally specific programs in different areas may have similar things that might be available as well. And I think that the critical thing, if you're looking for Indigenous representation on your MDT, is to not pigeonhole them or tokenize them, to just focus on being Indigenous, because they are so much more than that. They may have a whole background in behavioral health, or they may have adult protective services background. So really look at the other skills that they can bring to the table as well. So when we think about involving Indigenous partners, tribal partners, we really want to understand and respect. So recognizing that sovereignty, and that's really going to be, that sovereignty is really significant when you're working with a tribe as a partner. And that basically means they're probably in your service area. So I know for the Utah MD, or not, yeah, Utah, they have Navajo Nation is a part of one of their MDTs, and we've spent time talking about how to make the connection if they're going to serve on the part of the nation that is within Utah, so that they can get the appropriate permissions for that. And if anybody's got a similar situation, you can reach out to Redwind, make a TA request, and we can help you with that. Then the other thing, and this is true for people, whether you're working with a tribe or you're working with Indigenous populations, is really get an understanding of tribal history and resources and culture. So like one of the things that I know is that here in this part of Colorado, I'm standing on Ute land. I myself am a Navajo person, and part of Navajo Nation used to be part of Colorado, but also was significantly Ute land, and many tribes migrated through the land that's now called Colorado. And I know the history. I know about some of the massacres that took place in the area. I know about the federally recognized tribes in the state, and I also am aware of those tribal resources plus the Indigenous resources in our community here in Colorado Springs, as well as, because we don't have as many of those resources, so we also rely on the closest or bigger urban center to us to pull from resources. So learn about that. You know, you can Google it. There's a lot you can Google, but always double check to make sure your sources are accurate. And then recognize yourself as a guest on tribal land. One of the things that happens and from time to time is people are curious about tribes. People want to know about tribes. And as a part of that curiosity, sometimes they believe they belong in places they don't belong and don't understand why they don't belong there. And so for those of you that participate in organized religious beliefs and participate in a church or, you know, through, you know, temple or other forms of religions, that you might have spaces that not just anybody can walk into. You might have, you know, so say you're having a baptism or a christening or something like that. And those are going to be closed to the general public and, you know, and maybe invitation only. So similarly, tribes have ceremonies that may be open to the public and other activities open to the public. And then they may have some that are completely shut down and not allowed. And respect that. Ask. When in doubt, ask. And hear the answer, you know, and respect that answer. And then build your presence and relationships within the community. So here in Denver, we have the March Powwow, which is great. We have an Indian market in January. Those are great places to go. I personally love it. We have a powwow here in Colorado Springs on an annual basis in the late summer. And, you know, one of the things I always tell non-Native people, go to a powwow, go and observe, go learn, and experience. Go get yourself an Indian taco and, you know, enjoy the dances. Go to, you know, if there are cultural dances going on or something like that. You know, I go down to New Mexico a lot, and I go to different cultural events when I'm down there, and participate, you know, as much as you feel comfortable, and be present, because people will see you and people will notice you. And that's an important part of your credibility. If you're just here to do a piece of work, you're really not invested in the community. They want to see that you're connected, that you care, that you're going to stick around. And that's an important part of building that presence. So when we do that, we're working within our expertise. And with that, we're leaders together. We're advocates, always advocating for things to work best for each other, having the most positive outcomes that we can. And as a part of being advocates together, we are doing no harm. We are organizing, so we're raising awareness. We're making sure information is being shared, And we're monitoring for gaps. We're trying to make sure that we're doing as seamless as a response as possible. And if you really are working and serving a larger Indigenous population, I would encourage you to think about, how are you adding Indigenous staff to help with that effort? So I just want to acknowledge this quote by Dr. Corinne Sanchez. She's the director of Tewa Women United down in New Mexico. And she says, as we heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors and transform the future of our nations. So when I think about this work that we do, and I look at this picture here, and these handcuffs that you see were handcuffs that were used during the first forced removal. And we see in black and white some of our ancestors that were caught and photographed. And then as we move to the color pictures, actually the No More Stolen Sisters, you can see me in that picture. That's a march we did to bring awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women here at Colorado Springs. We marched from one of the local parks and we went to the courthouse, and we actually got great media attention and stuff like that. And so healing comes in many forms and in many ways. And I think important to think about your work as part of the healing work, that you have the ability through your work in small ways and big ways to transform the negative impacts of historical trauma and to heal the impacts of current trauma. So I just want to come back here again to our values and beliefs. And as we're considering the needs of elders, thinking about healing ceremonies, spirituality, traditional medicines as a part of it. And you as non-Native providers may not have access to that. That's where those partnerships with Native organizations can be helpful. One partnership I had when I used to live up in Duluth, Minnesota, was we were running a Native-based organization, and my former organization I worked in was a multicultural, served all populations, and they served a small population of Native people. So through that connection, we invited the Native survivors in that program to participate in our events that were survivor-centered. So those partnerships can be really valuable to help ensure that there's culturally specific responses to our elders in doing this work. I also want to acknowledge that Sarah dropped a link into the chat, and I just received an email this morning from OVW of President Biden's proclamation acknowledging National Native American Heritage Month this year, which is November. And I'm going to just read just a small quote out of it because it's quite lengthy. I can't go through all of that. But he says, Native roots are deeply embedded in this land, a homeland loved, nurtured, strengthened, and fought for with honor and conviction. This month and every month, we honor the precious, strong, and enduring cultures and contributions of all Native Americans and recommit ourselves to fulfilling the promise of our nation together. And the reason I wanted to say that is because that's what we're doing. We're really honoring these roots as we're being as, culturally responsive to our Indigenous elders. We're honoring those roots. We're recognizing and we're seeing them. And that's part of the healing process from that for them, is in the healing that in that we hear what they have to say. We're providing culturally specific options for them. Whether they choose that option or not, that's up to them. But that they know that it's being offered to them is really valuable. And depending on where that elder is, that elder may be really comfortable in their traditional way, or they may be wanting, some real mainstream resources. But the important part is that we offer that range so that they see themselves in what's available for them. And so I just want to stop and see if there's any questions
So Nancy had to jump off a little bit, but is still listening. And one question that she wanted to ask was, let me get it. She sent it to me. What would be good language to use to reach out to the Native Resource Center to share with them what we are doing with the EMDT and how we may be able to be helpful to them?
So the Native Resource Center, meaning like a local program kind of thing?
Yes, I take
Um,
that. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I would do is I would do like an introduction of their work and just acknowledge that, I would, describe their work. And as a part of it, I'm reaching out because I would imagine that you may be working with Native elders, and I want you to be aware of this resource. So I would want to start off just acknowledging what we're doing. And then one of the things about doing that outreach that happens is that people will get frustrated because they'll say, I sent an email and I never heard anything back. I kind of do the same thing. I might not respond back because it's like, like everybody in the country wants to reach out to me because I'm Native. And I have to make sure that what I'm responding back to is meaningful in terms of my energy. And so, I would want to start by sharing resources. Just do it, introduce yourself, give me a holler if you've got any questions or want to learn more. Share, send another email, send your brochure, maybe a product or an announcement, send another email, share a webinar, just share things for a while. And then at some point, I wouldn't let too much time go, but maybe a few months down the road, then I would ask if I could do a meeting with them. So if you have done some of that pre-work, so they kind of are starting to see you and to see that you're actually a little bit persistent, you're a little bit more than just flying through with one email, then reach out and ask for a conversation to talk about your work and how a connection between you might be helpful. And then either do it on a Zoom, or if you're in a place where COVID numbers are dropping, then try and do it in a socially distanced physical location and have that conversation. And then just keep building that, keep that communication open, and you'll find that at some point that relationship will be valuable. But to me, it's about, and I think I've said this at a PLG before, patience, persistence, and passion.
I agree. That pays off in any number of places.
Well, great. I want to thank everybody. And Lisa, please thank Nancy for that question, for being on this webinar today. And I just do want to remind you, if you've got any other questions and want to talk about any part of this in the way it relates to your work, to strengthen your ability to do this response, definitely reach out. We can do that. You can reach out to either me or Bonita. When you get the PowerPoint on the last slide, there'll be our contact information on it, and you'll see us at the PLGs too, or you can just do it through a TA request and we'll get pulled in on it. So thank you all.
Thank you. And see the evaluation survey in the chat. Please click on it and send in your feedback. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Vicki, for today and sharing the information as well as some of the journeys that you've experienced. Thanks, everyone.